Hi folks, so welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121 for fall 2021. So this is the House of Heaven, the Rise of Uruk. So what I'm going to do, or try to do rather, at the beginning of each of our major lectures is to give you a set of questions to sort of show you where we're going with the lecture so that you can keep them in mind and ensure that you can answer them when you go back over your notes at the end of the lecture. And you should be taking notes, guys. I mean, yes, these lectures will stay available all term, but if you take notes, you are much more likely to remember the content, which will be important for the final exam and for the midterm. So the questions we'll be addressing, why and how do cities emerge in early history? What caused the early evolution of urban life at Uruk? What role did the local environment play? What were the major characteristics of urban life at Uruk? How were they shaped by economic and cultural considerations? So you might be wondering why Uruk. This course is mostly about case studies. It's not a survey because we cannot cover the entire ancient world in a global context. But this case study is meant to contrast to our next one, which will be looking at the Harappan civilization, the civilization of the Indus Valley. And I hope that the two of them taken together will show you some of the diversity of ancient urban life. And of course, you are going to be reading a book that tackles more or less the same content for your book review. So this is, we have a little preparatory work for that, I would say. All right, so where do we begin when we're actually looking for early cities? We see cities as a marker of more complex societies. Is that fair entirely? Well, maybe, maybe not. Cities obviously don't pop up out of nowhere. They are the end of the process of development that is much longer. And this process, in many cases, stretches right back into the Neolithic period. So the basic building blocks for the city, things like shrines, house cisterns, public buildings, are all present in early Neolithic settlements. The cities themselves, when we see them, are centers. They are centers of economic, religious, and administrative functions. So as such, cities eventually tend to produce documents, which is also a good starting point for ancient historians. Although, of course, that's not true in all cases. You might ask yourself, what kind of information do we have about ancient cities? And the evidence base is quite diverse, actually. We do have buildings that remained in use from antiquity well into the historical period. We have the survival of ancient urban layouts. We have monuments that may no longer exist, but that have functions that were documented in literature. We have archaeological excavations and surveys. There are also ancient written sources, so documents, tablets, inscriptions, coins, seals. Now, there are centers that we might call proto-urban that have some of the characteristics of cities but not others. So these are places like Jericho and Catalhoyuk, and you're going to be reading about Catalhoyuk in your book for the book review, Four Lost Cities. But it is not until the 4th millennia BCE in Mesopotamia that we start to see cities of significant size in the archaeological record. We don't know why this is. We can make some educated guesses. There may have been population growth due to new trends in agriculture. There may have been climate change, allowing farming on land that had previously been difficult to work. So, for instance, if wetlands become drier, they can actually be very fertile. We might also have had nomadic peoples becoming sedentary, or new peoples entering the area due to factors that we can't even recognize. Could be a combination of all of the above, or things that are completely unknown to us. We're just guessing because we don't have evidence one way or the other. We just know that this development happened. So our case study for this lecture, as I said, is Uruk, whose origins are somewhere between 4000 and 3500 BCE. It is in what's now southern Iraq. Today it's called Warqa. Is it the first city in the area? Probably not. We know that several appeared around the same time, but it is the best known of the cities in the area from the ancient period, specifically because of its association with the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of our most famous ancient sources. There is a Syrian site, Tel Brak, where some of our more recent excavation suggests that it's actually older than Uruk. But Uruk gets all the press, essentially. Now, it was discovered, or rediscovered, I suppose, by Sir William Loftus, who was a British bureaucrat. He had investigated the site in the middle of the 19th century, found some of the archaeological remains, things like cuneiform tablets and clay coffins. He sent most of what he found that was movable back home to London, and this actually serves as the beginning of the Babylonian collection in the British Museum. But what happened is that because the monumental architecture in Uruk is not as exciting as other later sites, it took some time for archaeologists to come back and investigate it. Just before the First World War, a German team begins systematic excavation. This excavation is interrupted by the war, resumed after, then was interrupted again by World War II. This is sort of the way of things in the first half of the 20th century. Now, because of the German focus in the early archaeologists there was a heavy focus on architecture. Many of the original team had been architects, so this is a bit of a, I don't want to say a blind spot, but a slightly narrower perspective. And it did mean that they produced excellent surveys of the site. But if you look at archaeological writing about Uruk these days, there are a lot of complaints that the original team's focus on architecture meant that they neglected to look carefully at the stratigraphy of the site. So for instance, they took the potsherds and threw them out because they were rubbish when they should have been used to help establish the sequence of habitation at the site. This gets back to the whole 19th century archaeologists have a lot to answer for trope that we're going to come across again and again and again. Now, new methods and technologies allowed modern archaeologists to rectify some of these lapses, but excavation in the modern day was interrupted yet again by the wars in Iraq. Now, like all ancient cities, Uruk is actually multiple cities, built on top of each other as the earlier city was destroyed, abandoned, or renovated. The problem, of course, is that earlier cities are rarely completely destroyed, so the lines can be quite blurred when you've got builders incorporating structures from earlier periods. This is why you can't say with total certainty which Uruk is which. Now, we do know that in the late Uruk period, which is between 3100 and 2900 BCE, the city expanded enormously. The occupation size, so the amount of territory that the city covered, went from 81 hectares to 210. This did include suburban settlements, but the city center itself was 100 hectares. It's hard to gauge the population, but the sheer size of it suggests this is a major regional center. So it could potentially have had up to 80,000 people living in it. So why did this happen? Where did Uruk come from? One of the more compelling explanations I've seen is that Uruk is in an unusual ecological niche, sort of like a sweet spot. So it had excellent irrigation potential from the Euphrates River, and this allowed for intensive cultivation of the land. Now, to be fair, this type of irrigation eventually would cause damage to agriculture in the region by bringing in too much salt. Drainage isn't particularly good in the area, but this is a problem over time. It's not a problem that shows up right away. They were close enough to the steppe that they could draw on its resources, so animal husbandry and hunting were also quite common. They were close to marshes, and the marsh produced fish and fowl. It also produced water buffaloes that could be herded for milk. So the differentiation in food sources actually caused specialization amongst the producers and agricultural innovation. So we start to see the appearance of what's known as the seed plow, and this deposits seeds while the furrow is being plowed. This also needed further specialization in labor. But all in all, these sorts of developments wind up making farmers less self-sufficient. They're not just producing for themselves anymore, they're producing to sell. And this necessitates the further development of a system of exchange to make sure everyone got what they needed. So this, of course, feeds the economy in different ways and may have contributed to the expanded size of Uruk. The important thing to remember is that cities are organic things in the pre-modern period. They appear and grow to meet specific needs. All right, so realizing that I did not remove the animations from this as I intended to do, oh well. The majority of Uruk's population would still have been active in agriculture, but we also see evidence for a lot of different types of specialist craftsmen. So we've got archaeological evidence for the mass production of pots in the Uruk period. There's been a metal smelting workshop excavated in the city. We're not sure what they were doing, just that they were smelting metal of some kind. We have images and art that show figures at work weaving textiles, and we also have cylinder seals. So these are cylindrical seals made of shell, bone, or different types of semi-precious stones. A scene is carved in mirror image, and when you roll the seal over clay, it imprints the image. So this is an administrative device, and it is evidence for the existence of specialized craftsmen. Now, I wanted to mention the image in the slide just for a moment. So this is a copy of the Warka vase, which is one of our earliest examples of narrative relief structure. It is 3 feet tall. It weighed 600 pounds when it was intact. It was discovered in fragments. A cast was made of it, allowing the creation of a copy. And it shows the vegetation in the Tigris and Euphrates Delta, processions of animals, men carrying sacrificial items to the temple of Inanna. The original Warka vase was looted from the National Museum of Iraq in the 2003 invasion. The looters actually tore it off the case where it was mounted and left behind the base of the vase. It was returned a couple of months later as part of the amnesty that the government set up, but it was rebroken into 20 pieces. So it's a little bit sad, really. At least we have the copy. Now, Uruk's monumental architecture needs to be evaluated not just on the basis of the buildings, but on the public space it represents as a whole. So there are terraces, platforms, and large compounds. Temples in the city of Uruk are very striking. They are rebuilt several times. They are expanded and decorated with multicolored clay cones to form geometric mosaic patterns. They think there are two major temple areas. The White Temple, which was dedicated to the worship of the sky god An, and the Inanna Precinct, which was dedicated to his daughter, Inanna, the goddess of fertility, war, and sex. These are very sizable temples. Archaeologists have estimated that the construction of the White Temple, in particular, would have taken 1,500 laborers 5 years. But the emphasis seems to have been on creating open spaces and easy access, a lack of enclosed areas, which suggests that sort of broader public spirit was at work. Maybe society was a bit more egalitarian than we realized in that period. But we also see frequent demolition and rebuilding, and this suggests that they may have had a sort of experimental attitude towards building. Arguably, this is evidence against the monumental architecture being an attempt to create any kind of legacy. I mean, if you're just going to tear it down and build it again to try something new, it's not going to stand and represent your family or your career. It also suggests that the redistribution of goods was a very public part of life in Uruk. Any kind of collection of products in early societies was often very heavily ritualized. So what we believe is that the temples collected goods and then redistributed them, especially to the lower classes of urban laborers. You know, those who weren't producing their own food, but who weren't producing crafts that would allow them to buy food for themselves. The redistribution of goods is what requires the development of an administrative class. So this means the use of standard weights and measures, accounting mechanisms, and eventually writing systems to record everything. Sorry, we'll just get that up here. All right, just had an image here. This is a cylinder seal and an impression that it created. So you see how the seal was rolled over the clay and what it sort of pushes into the clay as a pattern. I just wanted you to actually see what a cylinder seal looked like before we continued. Now, what kind of writing system existed in Uruk? Originally, what we would call proto-cuneiform, and it is drawn into clay by thin lines. This basically starts because of seals. Now, seals are impressed on jars and containers as well to reflect that some bureaucratic authority had guaranteed its contents. The quantity is not usually indicated. We don't actually see that until the appearance of bullae and numerical tablets. Bullae were hollow spheres of clay with seals rolled over their surfaces, and they contained groups of small objects we called tokens. These are clay or stone pieces meant to record the number of particular items in that box or container. The bullae itself is a sort of clay envelope guaranteeing the contents with the seal. But you can't open them. Well, you can open them, but you have to destroy them to open them. So what happens instead is that you see the development of bullae with impressions of the tokens inside, which then eventually develop into tablets with sets of numerical signs. Now, we don't know what kind of goods were actually recorded, but there's clearly a sophisticated system at work. Now, eventually we see examples of numbers along with signs that are obviously intended to indicate a specific good. Proto-cuneiform involved both numbers and words. The former was important because most of the tablets we have were accounts. And there were multiple different systems at work, where the shape of the numeral was different depending on what it was measuring. Different symbols could mean different things when used in different contexts. I'm hoping you're beginning to see the challenge to scholars. Now, there's a group of 900 signs that are designated for non-numerical concepts. These are either physical items or an action. Where did they come from? We're not sure. Some were inspired by the objects. So for instance, there's something that looks like an ox head for an ox. Others were arbitrary. Others were combinations of other signs. And we see these signs in another group of tablets found at Uruk. These are the lexical tablets. They are lists of words designating cities, officials, animals, plants, manufactured goods. They are used to teach scribes how to write. Probably the tablets were in fact written by scribes who were practicing. Now, later in Mesopotamian history, we see these types of tablets become much longer and more complex. So they're basically a standard part of scribal practice rather. There is no real connection to spoken language, although there are some indications that the signs were developed by people who spoke Sumerian. Cuneiform was never used to give a phonetic rendering of a text, even if it could. It could record any language, hence why we see it used by so many different groups. Now, later, the number of signs is reduced, and instead of lines drawn into the clay, there are wedge-shaped lines impressed into the clay. So that's the classic cuneiform. But there's no straight line of evolution for writing. Different types exist at different times. These are different ways of trying to conceptualize the world. Scribes are trying to figure out what worked the best. Cuneiform is the eventual end result. Obviously, it also takes some considerable amount of time for this writing system to evolve into something that can be used for different types of text, like literature. All right. So the question of social structure is an interesting one in the context of Uruk period cities. The temple organizations were apparently quite concerned with hierarchy. So we have something called the Standard List of Professions that was first written at the end of the late Uruk period and which was then copied for 1300 years. And it actually provides a hierarchy of occupations. At the top is an enigmatic entry, which in the late Mesopotamian copies simply renders as king, but that's probably an anachronism. It's more like priest king. So what we can see looking at this and other evidence is that there's a difference between the lower classes in the city and the lower classes outside the city. The ones in the city appear to have been dependent on the temples for regular rations of grain, whereas the ones outside the city don't get the same level of support, but they had a higher degree of freedom. Even Uruk's urban population was likely not totally divorced from the agricultural context. But if we're looking at even 50,000 people, they wouldn't have been producing enough food right there to feed themselves, especially if they were doing things like building temples with their days. Now, what this means is that the organization and formalization of the distribution of food was necessary, and those outside the city were necessary in order to supply that food. So this means they get privileges. And this is something to remember about ancient societies. Certain groups are often granted rights and privileges, but those rights and privileges come because they also have specific responsibilities. It's a way of balancing them. Now, we do know that the influence of Uruk-style city living was fairly widespread. The trends in their culture spread from southern Mesopotamia elsewhere. So if you look at the city of Susa in southwest Iran, it actually mimicked Uruk's pottery and proto-cuneiform writing. We see Uruk-inspired goods and writing far to the north and east as well. And even in more distant regions, we see Uruk-style monumental architecture, sometimes in enclaves that may have been settlers from Uruk, but also just more generally present, and imitation, as always, is the sincerest form of flattery. Now, Uruk-style cities would have brought with them similar forms of social and economic hierarchy, because you have to have command over men and material if you're going to build monumental architecture. It's not something that's done in isolation. And it's likely that they also had a shared sense of the role of these monumental buildings. We can't, for instance, assume that the labor is forced, because in most cases it probably was not. You cannot, in many cases, force huge numbers of slaves to do this type of work. It is something that people do as part of what is perceived to be their religious or social duties. Now, in conclusion, we can't know for sure why urbanism suddenly appears in this particular part of the world, and yet not in regions that are even relatively close by. Certainly the environment would have had something to do with it. They would have been in a warmer period, which facilitated more intensive agriculture. And once you have more intensive agriculture, this generates surplus. It generates surplus in goods, which generates surplus in population. And once you have a population boom, there's all kinds of possibilities. But then again, the warmer weather and the rise in sea levels may have also made it more difficult for farming villages in Mesopotamia to carry out agriculture on their own. Their fields would have been easy to irrigate, but hard to drain. So there might have been an incentive to pool their resources and their labor, and this could have been part of the motivation for urban development. Now, this is a good description of potential conditions around Uruk, but it's not true for sites elsewhere like Tel Brak, which wouldn't have had the same problem because it was in a drier region. So it's probably best to say that urban development was the solution to different problems at different times. Something made the reorganization of society seem like a good idea, and urbanism has to have offered some type of advantage in most cases over simpler forms of social organization, because if it didn't, why do it? Now, we also can't overlook the fact that it's very hard to change the social hierarchy back once you've made it more complex and more hierarchical. Once you commit to urbanism, is there any going back, even if it's not working out as well? So basically, we have loads of interesting questions to which we will likely never have answers that don't involve time travel. And on that somewhat comical note, at least I hope it was comical, we will end there, and stay tuned for our next lecture on the Harappan civilization. Thanks very much, guys.